Hello there, I'm Noel Hacegaba, Deputy Executive Director at the Port of Long Beach. Welcome to Supply Chain Insight, where we explore the latest trends, issues, and news in the supply chain with top industry leaders, experts, and influencers. Our objective is to bring you the insight you need to help keep your cargo moving. Now, today's business executives expect a lot from their supply chains: efficiency, velocity, flexibility, cost management, and certainly operational excellence. Supply Chain Insight brings the supply chain to you, one segment at a time, to explore new approaches and innovative solutions that will help you and the Port of Long Beach deliver greater value to our customers and partners. Now, today's episode highlights a new initiative here at the Port of Long Beach that strives to enhance speed to market for e-commerce fulfillment supply chains. With the historic growth in e-commerce over the past 3 years and the acceleration in online shopping that's expected to continue in the years ahead, this initiative could not come at a better time. And our guest today is Vincent Iacopella, who is the Executive Vice President at Alba Wheels Up. But our guest wears so many other hats, which is why he is our guest today. Vince, why don't you tell our audience a little bit more about what you do to drive not just supply chains, but e-commerce fulfillment supply chains?
Thank you, Noel, and thank you to the Port of Long Beach, not only for the platform to talk about this, but also for the agility that the Port has showed on this issue. I am Vince Iacopella, EVP Growth and Strategy at Alba Wheels Up. I've been involved in Asia Pacific, managing Asia Pacific relationships with importers and exporters for about 35 years here in Los Angeles and up and down the West Coast, mostly on trade sensitive types of shipments that include high regulatory touch with Customs and Border Protection, Food and Drug Administration, EPA, and also an emerging trade-sensitive topic for cross-border enforcement and supply chain is e-commerce and direct-to-consumer.
Well, Vince, I can't think of a better person to have on for today's episode, and thank you for your leadership and service to our industry. Let's begin by setting the stage. Now, e-commerce transactions have been on the rise for quite some time, and the need to fulfill e-commerce orders has only intensified as a result. I mean, even before the pandemic, online sales were already forecasted to double within 5 years, and the pandemic certainly accelerated that growth. Give us a pulse of the e-commerce market, where things are today, and where you see things headed in the future.
So, Noel, that's right. Really, the trend to the explosion in direct-to-consumer and e-commerce consumer purchases started before 2020, before the pandemic, for a couple of reasons. Three main confluence of issues that created, if you will, the perfect storm. There was a regulatory change in 2016 for cross-border e-commerce that raised the de minimis value from $200 to $800. Most importantly, there was a genuine organic change in the way consumers purchase goods before the pandemic, which accelerated exponentially during the pandemic, is that people were not shopping at brick and mortar stores as much. And the third issue that I would point to would be the China duties of 2017 and 2018, the Section 301 duties. And what those did is they forced resellers, platforms, and importers to really look at e-commerce separately from the rest of the supply chain when it came to eligibility for duty-free treatment, because the duties were so much higher. We all saw during the pandemic, I mean, on my own block in LA, 3 or 4 trucks or more a day, and leaving your front doorstep and tripping over the boxes that are on your front doorstep. You asked what's happening now and what the future holds. One of the things we saw during the pandemic was a migration of direct-to-consumer or e-commerce shipments, which used to be exclusively in the air mode, transitioning over to the ocean mode. That is continuing in certain circumstances, which actually facilitated the discussion we're going to have today. And data suggests that even post-pandemic, that online shopping and online sales is projected for rapid growth still.
That's fantastic insight, Vince. Thank you for sharing. Of course, as consumers, all we see is a screen and with a couple clicks of a button, you place your order and you expect it in many cases the next day, right? So that really puts pressure on e-commerce fulfillment. As a matter of fact, e-commerce fulfillment requires a specialized supply chain compared with other supply chains, and it's more sensitive to time, and so speed of market becomes more critical, literally by the minute. Give us a sense of what the e-commerce supply chain looks like and the special requirements to make sure the container reaches each point along its journey on time.
Noel, thanks for that question. So I think e-commerce redefined speed to the meaning of speed to market. We had that phrase prior to direct to consumer, but it has a whole new meaning with a direct to consumer timeframe. Traditionally, e-commerce was in the air mode for prior to departure at origin. You had to identify who the U.S. consumer was. It would come in by air and get delivered to last mile. What we saw during the pandemic is this migration toward ocean, where you didn't always know who the direct consumer was, and where you could move inventories to Mexico or Canada and hold them there until it was sold to U.S. consumer. So you saw that model growing during the pandemic. And as you know, we picked up the phone and called the port. We had a couple of brands that were selling maybe only 20, 30% of their product online. They still had a traditional model in the legacy model on a B2B, a business to business model, but they did have this growing portion of their inventory that was being sold to consumer. And there were some specific challenges at the height of the Asia Pacific and Trans-Pacific congestion. Obviously, the costs that had been rising prior to the pandemic on duties, but now also the shipping costs rising in 21 and 22. And most importantly, and by the way, this was not limited to direct to consumer, this was system wide to anyone who had consumer goods, was the cost, the opportunity cost and the net financial cost of dwell time, having boats waiting to dock, having congestion in the terminal, having maybe not leveraging advanced data as a system-wide environment as much as we could have, all of us in the port structure. So that really highlighted, we were hearing from brands what they needed to stay in the San Pedro Bay ports with a direct-to-consumer ocean product, whether they had identified the consumer or whether that was going to inventory in northern Mexico, waiting to be sold. And we came to the Port of Long Beach, who showed tremendous agility to keep those brands in the Port of Long Beach. We were losing market share to Canadian ports, to Mexican ports, to Gulf ports. So really, the speed to market, the opportunity cost on dwell was really then the big challenge.
Yeah, thanks for that shout out, Vince. And it really was it takes a village, as they say. It took really the entire port ecosystem to come together. But you're right, at the height of the pandemic, we made vacant land available for surge capacity and provide immediate relief. We expanded hours of operation. And these are all things that hit at the heart of what we're wrestling with now, which is competitiveness, right? How do we deliver greater value and keep those boxes here and attract those boxes that may have gone elsewhere temporarily? So picking up on what you said, recognizing the need to support growing container volumes of e-commerce product through the Port of Long Beach, you came to us and you asked us, how could we collaborate to address this growing niche market together? And that conversation evolved into e-commerce Speed to Market Task Force. Now tell us about that task force. Who was involved and what did the task force do?
Yes. Well, again, I have to give kudos to the port on the agility and how quickly we mobilized. What turned out to be an informal discussion on how to keep a couple of brands in our port turned into a really truly diverse multi-stakeholder discussion that included customs brokers, truckers, 3PLs, the ports, one platform, marketplace. And we really heard from the stakeholders it was eye-opening to hear from all the stakeholders on what their perspective was, on what they needed to stay in the Port of Long Beach, in the San Pedro Bay ports, and also to stay competitive in those ports. Obviously, our findings were, I want to be clear here, many of the feedback we got was specific to e-commerce, and much of it was aligned with the systemic observations that other business-to-business shippers were experiencing, the usual suspects like ocean carrier policy on demurrage and detention, extended hours of operation for the terminals, the dwell on the congestion in the port, and a huge focus on the fact that all of us have this data, especially customs brokers and freight forwarders have this data really early. How could we leverage this data better? How can we partner with the ports, the Port of Long Beach, to leverage this data for efficiencies? And so the takeaways for e-commerce were very similar to the rest of the supply chain. Things like equipment, box rules, and those types of things, appointment systems, efficiencies. However, what we noticed by talking to the stakeholders was that the effect on e-commerce was maybe more profound because of that need to get to speed to market. And the consumer has this expectation that it's going to be there in a certain amount of time. And so there was a little more, I would say, of a business commercial dividend on that.
Yeah. Thanks for that insight, Vince. And, appreciate that summary of what this task force has done. So what are the next steps? Now that you have the findings, you were able to diagnose the issues that need to be addressed to support e-commerce fulfillment. What are the next steps for the e-commerce speed to market task force?
Well, Noel, thanks for that. So I should point out that we met for about a year and a half, and under Noel was almost in every meeting, and the staff of Long Beach, along with the stakeholders, there was a tremendous commitment from the port. I think the takeaways were in our recommendations, which we hope to publicize next week or sooner. We made several recommendations, but I'll group them for time efficiency. We made recommendations about extended port hours. We made recommendations about leveraging advanced data, and we recommended a pilot program for participants who have direct-to-consumer and want to stay in the ocean mode and want to stay in the Port of Long Beach to plug into the pilot, a multi-stakeholder pilot that would focus on those issues pertaining to leveraging advanced data, talking about extended work hours, a demand-driven appointment system, a demand-driven type of mechanism to get trucks into the port. And obviously, what's not in the purview of the port, there is a piece on demurrage and detention, because that obviously is a cost, an unbudgeted cost that had a huge effect on all shippers during the height of the congestion. So we want to finish with what we call the virtual port. And I think to simplify that concept, it's really creating an environment of stakeholders that share this idea, share this ideal, and share this commitment to leveraging advanced data, to participating in a different supply chain for these e-commerce shippers.
Well, as I said at the beginning, Vince, and you're continually validating this throughout our conversation, this initiative could not have come at a better time. With container volumes down year over year here on the West Coast, shippers are looking for reasons to come back. So let's talk about the value proposition. How could improving speed of market for e-commerce supply chains enhance service for all containers?
So, Noel, thanks for bringing that up, because I think that's huge. You don't really want to solve a problem for one section of the market and not for the whole market. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity now to deal with these issues that were being raised at the height of the congestion. And many of the suggestions we make, to your point, are not specific to e-commerce. They're systemic issues that we've been talking about for years. The appointment systems, leveraging advanced data, extended hours of operation, which is, I think, the new way to say 24/7. Because 24/7 is a great goal, but let's start with extended hours of operation, a demand-driven system, things like a gray chassis pool, equipment management, and carrier policy that is more conducive to the users. I think the opportunity for our region is that we're watching one, the Imperial Valley has so much value as a last mile fulfillment center post clearance when it arrives in the market. I don't know any other port that has that much capacity on 3PL, third party logistics. We have the most customs brokers per capita of any port in the country, and expertise and customs attorneys and all the people in supply chain. The last emerging opportunity that I see for the port is that what we learned in the pandemic is that those goods that are going to northern Baja, that are waiting to be fulfilled and come into the U.S. duty free under $800 to U.S. consumers, really the only port that has the capacity are San Pedro Bay ports, and the Port of Long Beach is in a pivotal position to position itself to take advantage of that. And I'll just add this one last piece. A lot of the infrastructure that was built for direct to consumer is now being leveraged for nearshoring for companies that want to diversify out of Asia and finish goods in Mexico. So I see tremendous opportunity for the port. And a tremendous opportunity excited to go to the next step and take those recommendations and take those ideas and get a group of folks together that will execute them.
Exciting times ahead, my friend. Well, Vince, thanks again for joining us today. We appreciate your leadership and your partnership, and we certainly look forward to continue collaborating with you on this important initiative. And to our valued audience, stay tuned for additional updates on this e-commerce supply chain initiative. In the meantime, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon for another episode of Supply Chain Insight, brought to you by the Port of Choice, the Port of Long Beach.